Hey everyone, I'm David Pompiani. Welcome back to my channel. Today we have a wild one. How did iguanas, yes, those leafy herbivorous reptiles, end up on the islands of Fiji and Tonga, almost 8,000 kilometers away from their nearest relative? On the show today, I'm here to look at a new study that seeks to answer how these iguanas ended up in these faraway islands using cutting edge DNA research coupled with biogeographic modeling. And the person that did that, or at least one of the authors, the lead author, is here today, Simon Scarpetta. Hi, Scott. Simon. How's it going?
Great. How are you doing, David?
So let's get right into it. How did these iguanas, if their nearest relatives are from the Americas and specifically desert iguanas, how did they make this epic journey? And what convinced you that they must have rafted across the ocean as opposed to, walking across land or maybe old islands or Pangea or something like that? So could you, what convinced you they rafted and got
Yeah,
there?
yeah, of course. So, yeah, again, thanks for having me on the show. Super excited to be here and talk about the paper. And so I'd say it's a combination of different things that come from pretty much all the different parts of my academic background, which has been super nice. So I have one hat as a paleontologist and one hat now as someone working on phylogenomics. And so I got to put together different data sources from throughout my research career to really tell this story. And so I think a good place to start is definitely one, what you were talking about first, which is that Fijian iguanas, they're way, way out in the South Pacific, 8,000 kilometers or more from any other iguana.
Hmm.
And so, really the first thing that I found in this research project and that convinced me or started to convince me that this is really the only explanation is exactly what you said, that they're most closely related, not just to iguanas in general, but to North American desert iguanas, the
Desert
modern
iguanas.
ones that we have now. And so that was really thing one, that when I was working on my broader postdoctoral project that I started and did a lot of at UC Berkeley and then have continued as a professor at the University of San Francisco. That was really big step one and starting to nail that down.
And that's where you're at currently, right? San Francisco.
Exactly, yeah. Which was super convenient. I just got to bop over the bay from from where I'd been doing my postdoc and then started up at USF.
Now, for the people that are unaware, how does an iguana go about building a raft or any animal? I think probably the public is unaware that at times animals somehow either acquire a raft. I'm assuming iguanas don't actively construct one.
They do not,
They,
unfortunately.
yeah, unfortunately, as far as I'm aware. And how did the iguanas get on a raft to somehow make it to Fiji and Tonga? What? How, like 30 some million years ago? Explain
Yeah,
a
30,
situation.
34. Yeah, of course. So it's actually something that we can see in the modern day pretty well. So sometimes after a large storm, sometimes a hurricane, sometimes a cyclone, could even be really, really extensive rain. Any kind of major weather event that could uproot a tree or displace a bunch of vegetation and then cause it to move into a water body, whether it's the ocean or a river, and then have that sort of tangled up mass of vegetation move along with the currents of the ocean or the sea or the river and then go from one place to the other. And so, independent of animals, this is something that we've all probably seen either live or, on television footage or something after a hurricane. And you see, vegetation or other things that have been knocked over and are moving from one place to the other. And so in iguanas specifically, people have actually seen this in real time in person, which is so, so cool. So in 1995, a group of researchers, after a hurricane, they're out in the Caribbean. And so they saw a kind of, mat, what we call a floating vegetation mat of uprooted trees and other vegetation that had been knocked over by the winds and by the rain. And it was actually floating along from the islands of Guadeloupe. And then it ended up on the island of Anguilla. also in the Caribbean. And on that raft of floating vegetation were 15 or more green iguanas. And so they actually made, an over 300-kilometer voyage in real time that people actually got to see from one island that they had lived on before to an island that they hadn't lived on before. And so that's really the mechanism is usually some kind of big storm, some big weather event knocks over vegetation. It kind of gets all tangled up and moves along with the current. And then animals that may be in that vegetation or may have been nearby or, may have been in the water cling onto it and then get moved from one place to the other.
That's an interesting observation there. As you said, how many individuals were on this raft?
It was at least 15, is I think what they were able to count. It's possible that there are others in there.
Yeah,
So, 15 made it. And then not only did they make it, but they were able to establish on arrival. So
that's
they,
exactly what I was going to say is you need enough to have genetic, you at least need a male and a female, but you need a couple of them so you don't become like inbred too much. And I'm a
exactly.
geologist, in case you don't know. I don't have any college background in genetics. I didn't even take a college biology course. I was like focused on geochemistry, rocks, and
I love that.
sedimentology, and isotopes, and dating, and radiocarbon. So just an FYI. Um, but yeah, you can raft an individual. That sounds plausible, but to raft enough individuals of a species to have a founder population seems to be like a little bit crazier. So 15 they saw on that raft that made it like 300 kilometers. That's pretty amazing. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. And they were completely, they were fine. They were ready to rumble when they got there.
And you imagine desert iguanas, which probably are more hardy in terms of survivability on a raft, because unless rain is hitting it, there's no drinking water. So can you speak to how they would survive these rafting journeys and what makes them able to do that?
Yeah. Yeah, of course.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah. So I guess first it's worth mentioning it wouldn't have been, whatever the ancient iguanas that made the voyage to Fiji, it wouldn't have been exactly desert iguanas. It would have been, something that was an ancestor of desert iguanas and
Okay,
Fijian
yeah.
iguanas. But no, completely fair. But yeah, so pretty much across the entire group, they're large on the lizard end of things. And so they kind of have a decent amount of body mass. They're also all ectothermic, which was, oftentimes in popular science, I guess, called cold blooded, although we generally try to avoid that term. But what that means is that they aren't using what they eat to generate heat nearly so much as mammals and birds are. And it means that they can forego food for much longer periods of time than, you or I would be able to, or anyone listening. And then on top of that, iguanas during the winter time, they undergo a process called brumation, which is similar to hibernation, where, when it gets cold or when it gets cool, especially for the desert iguanas and chuckwallas that we have in the US, they'll kind of hunker down, go into a state of torpor that's similar to hibernation that you probably think of with bears or, mice or things like that. And they can just not eat for a pretty long time. So they're large. They can, they have a little bit of body mass. They cannot eat for a decent amount of time. And then on top of that, many species are additionally resistant to dehydration. And so, particularly the desert iguanas, like you mentioned, and they're so cool. I've seen them a lot of times and caught a lot and observed their behavior, and they're really wonderful animals. But they live in some of the driest places in the world that have, little to no fresh water. And so they pretty much get all of their water just by consuming vegetation.
Mm.
And so, if, potentially the ancestor of Fijian iguanas and desert iguanas had some of that tolerance, then they would have been uniquely predisposed to be able to survive on a raft. But on top of that, most iguanas are, particularly the adults, they're obligate herbivores. So they just eat, vegetation, they eat leaves.
Hmm.
The young individuals, the juveniles, will sometimes eat insects, but grown up iguanas pretty much only eat vegetation and fruit. So on the raft or on any raft for any iguana that's ever dispersed from one place to the other via oceanic rafting, they probably had food on the voyage. And so I think they're one of those groups that just has an awesome and unique combination of features that predisposes them to be able to survive a rafting trip like this.
Hmm. So let's explore a little bit of this, the idea of these rafts and creating natural rafting producing events.
Yeah, yeah, of course.
So I could definitely see a hurricane or a flood. It washes a bunch of stuff in the river, gets jammed up, compacted, unclogs, and then a gigantic raft of debris comes out into a delta. That sounds like definitely a plausible way of creating one. But in terms of having a big enough one to have like vegetation or anything in a big enough founder population, I think you need other things, maybe other processes. And one thing that comes to mind to me would be tsunamis
Hmm.
and landslides on
Mm,
very tectonically active coastlines. And, today, the Pacific Northwest would be an example of that, where you have these really stark coastlines that could just shear off.
right.
And also volcanic activities can do that too. So I'd add that into there. So you plate tectonics, volcanoes, and tsunamis as in terms of generating rapid, huge rafts where big populations can be found on. And any other ones you can think of, or are there any examples in the literature of like tsunamis or landslides making big rafts?
Honestly, not that I can think of. As you were saying that, I was like, huh, that's a super cool idea that I had not thought of or heard before. And yeah, you're definitely right about Pacific Northwest and then also California too, being
Yeah,
tectonically really active areas where, yeah, landslides or other events might cause vegetation to suddenly, or earthquakes to suddenly
yeah,
fall into the water. So yeah, no, that's actually a super interesting idea that I haven't really heard about. I think when people talk about it with respect to dispersal events, so, moving from one place to the other, they pretty much mostly think of hurricanes, cyclones,
yeah.
and, the wind and rain that could knock over so many trees or so many bits of large vegetation that all then get clumped together in a current. But I like the tectonic idea. I'm kind of
Mhm.
interested to pursue that more and see if anyone's observed that.
I bring that up because when I work at the University of Hawaii now, and
Awesome.
uh, taught. It's pretty sweet. I taught a class in natural environment, and the island we're on, uh, Oahu and Kaneohe, are basically old volcanoes, and the windward side is Kaneohe. It blew off. The northern part of the island blew off, and you can see it with the bathymetric maps, like this gigantic slump. It's like, well, someone maybe fact check. It's like 1,000 kilometers. It's a gigantic
My
slump.
God,
Yeah, it's like
that is
800,
wild.
1,000 kilometers, and you could see this huge part of the island just slumped out in the ocean. And they just are like, yeah, when you're reading about it, like, oh yeah, we think it just blew off and slid off at one point, like a few million years ago, like 2, 3 million years ago, because the whole
So
island
recent.
itself is only 3 million years old. The big island of Hawaii is like 100,000 years old itself, and it's
So
huge. It's
young.
it's like triple the whatever size of this island. But those events happen where this freaking island blew off, and then imagine all the coconuts and palm trees just flying
Flying
out there,
everywhere.
because we know coconuts make sense to me. Coconuts make
Exactly. Yeah.
sense. Yeah, they have these little seeds that can float, and the wood's buoyant on the tree. You can
Hmm.
definitely imagine some kind of entanglement of things not happening. So, and also the reason I bring up the rafting question is because this paper on iguanas is super cool, because it's 8,000 kilometers supposedly, or that's what you're estimating in the title of your paper. And the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, which I'll show, is iguanas rafted more than 8,000 kilometers from North America to Fiji. What is that, like a third of the distance of Earth?
Yeah, I think it's around a quarter of the circumference.
Quarter of the circumference of Earth
I know. That's
on a
wild. That's
raft.
wild.
So people I'm sure there are people that this is the first time they've heard this, because I heard of the rafting stuff a little back when I was at Kansas State during my postdoc.
Oh,
And
nice.
this stuff blew my mind because I found out the long distance rafting example of the New World monkeys. And this is what I would want to bring up with you.
Yeah,
Now, monkeys are different than iguanas. We are all
very.
very, very aware they are mammals. And I'm assuming, we're also talking about their ancestor. Like, it's good that you pointed that out. This is like 30 million years ago. Somehow, maybe you can fill in the details. I'm sure you know, can tell it better. Somehow, New World monkeys can trace their origin back to the Old World, Africa, and they suddenly arrive in the New Worlds like 30 million years ago too. And that's around the same time now the iguanas show up in Fiji and Tonga, right?
Yeah. Or I guess, yeah, I think for that, the original paper, I think the one I'm thinking of was based on fossils that they suddenly found. So yeah, for our paper, 30 million, 34 million, I'd say is around, that's the max. So, I
Okay.
think that's
Yeah,
yes, but it could have been more recently. It could have been a little bit more recently even.
yeah. And these monkeys didn't go 8,000 kilometers. I also want to make clear too. It's
Yeah,
like 1,000 or 1,500, which is,
still a lot.
very, still a lot, but a lot less. So we're not talking about those kind of distances, but to have a founding population of mammals, primates on a raft, then they get 1,000 kilometers. I could only
That's
imagine
wild.
what this looked like. It's like, imagine a pirate ship full of monkeys that are starving and
Yeah.
dehydrated.
Waving their little sad flags.
And they're just ready to eat they're probably cannibalizing. Oh my, that's
My
probably
God,
what's
yeah.
going on. They're probably cannibalizing. But still, then
They
that
have to
makes,
find food somewhere.
yeah. Anyway, so can you talk about a little bit this origin of the New World monkeys in Africa and how they came to be in the South America?
Yeah. So to be honest, it's not something that particular dispersal event is definitely not something I know too much about.
Hmm.
And so I'm trying to remember the paper that I saw. I think it was also published in PNAS, Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. And they ended up, from my recollection, having really cool fossil evidence to
Hmm.
show that they came over from the Eastern Hemisphere to the Western Hemisphere around that time frame. I'm also trying to remember whether it might have been slightly, um, wish I had the paper in front of me. But yeah, I think it's
Hmm.
another one of these events where you have, using either genetic data and the fossil record, you can put together, and also the extant distributions, so the modern distributions of where they are, you
Yeah.
can put together this story that, based on everything we know, they had to have come over, and the only real route is rafting. And
Hmm.
it's actually good that you pointed out about the distances too, because transatlantic rafting is actually much more common in
Hmm.
terrestrial vertebrates than it is to go across the Pacific, or even to move across, islands in the Indian Ocean, really, really long distances.
Hmm.
So across the Atlantic, there's monkeys, and then there's also a couple examples in skinks, and I believe one in geckos too, where similar kinds of stories, based on the timing and based on where most of the distribution is, in the Eastern Hemisphere, the only route that they could have used to get from Africa to the Americas would have been, crossing the Atlantic, which is just, it's so cool.
It's, and so that is an example, though, of I think the raft had to be something bigger than like a thing of trees in the water. Like I could see iguanas just hanging on, going dormant, and then maybe
Yeah.
licking off the dew. Enough. Like how many monkeys would you need to bring on a raft that they don't become inbred? Is there like a number that you could, like male and females, that they could then have a decent founding population?
It's a great question. And honestly, I'm not sure. Because again, the main examples of people having, observed this live were, with lizards. So, with
Hmm.
lizards, we're like, all right, something more than 10
Yeah,
seems to
that
be
makes.
reasonable. But with monkeys, I kind of agree. It would have to, you would feel like it would need to be something somewhat higher. But could the raft have really been that much larger than, a big mass of trees put together? I think that's a
Yeah,
good question too.
yeah, that's what I'm thinking. That
Yeah.
you have a tsunami event, even though a lot less tectonic activity between the western coast of Africa and the eastern coast of the U.S., except the Caribbean's pretty active.
Yeah.
But yeah, but I'm thinking you would have to have some kind of event that like the land slides off, like a chunk of the forest, the roots are grabbing the soil, imagine, and then it just collapses and it's almost like a mass rather than just like a few trees. I mean, I can't imagine, a couple dozen trees, and it has to be able to collect water for these monkeys. Or if they're not drinking water, they could be cannibalizing themselves. But then that means they had to start out with even higher population because they still some survived to get there.
Get there and then start breeding.
Yeah, because
No,
I
it's a
can.
super good question. And again, and if then one of the main figures in our recently published paper, we sort of put the proposed distances of all these dispersals together. You'll really
Hmm,
see that all of the longer ones are in lizards or even snakes, but mostly lizards. And exactly what you're talking about with mammals. And then, yeah, also the fact that they're endotherms, so like they're using the things that they eat to keep up a high metabolism and to generate
yeah,
body heat. They'd have to eat a lot more.
they'd have to eat a
So,
lot more.
yeah, it really limits the extent to which endothermic animals can disperse that long. But yeah, this question about how many would have to get there, it's really interesting. And I
Hmm.
do wonder about the size of the raft too. I'd have to go back and look, but I'm pretty sure that no one has proposed anything like a landslide knocking out, that much. So I think it's an interesting idea and definitely one that I want to look into more.
If you publish, if you don't mind, just put me in the acknowledgement ad, and then link my podcast.
Like the podcast.
You mentioned it there. But the another thing that came to mind is this is just getting really now kind of outside, but could
Yeah,
there be
yeah, for sure.
fruit trees, in this landslide, fruiting trees that these monkeys ate the fruit? That would explain water, nutrients combined with a little bit of cannibalism, and you could maybe have a raft that sustains, or they eat something similar to a coconut and it's in the raft itself, maybe built-in food to survive
Yeah,
the 1,000-kilometer journey.
no, I think that's a great point. Yeah, the food issue can't be ignored, and it has to be a little bit more consistent for monkeys and for iguanas. Because yeah, iguanas can go without eating for months at a time, and anyone who's ever kept a snake before has had that experience too.
Hmm.
They can go without months. They can go for months without eating mice, and then all of a sudden they're hungry one day. But in the intervening period, they're just kind of chilling. Uh,
Yeah,
but yeah, not the case with rodents, not the case with monkeys. I think what you're saying about the fruit is also a great point. If it was the kind of tree that had something that they could eat on it, that would help a
yeah.
lot.
Now the public is listening, people are listening, and this might be the first time they've ever heard the idea that species randomly raft around and show up in new places and just kind of evolutionarily come out of nowhere in a way. How does one go about, like with your study specifically, how did you go about proving, what were your methods for like a layperson to proving genetically that the Fiji iguanas are most closely related to the North American desert iguana?
Yeah, of course. Um, so there have been a number of different studies done previously using relatively smaller genetic data sets to try and figure out how iguanas were related to each other. And they'd all kind of done a good job of resolving some of the other relationships, but never really been able to pin down Fiji iguanas and desert iguanas. And so what we did for this study is we collected coding regions. We collected a lot of different DNA sequences from parts of the genome that are related to sex chromosomes, parts of the genome that are not, parts of the genome that code for proteins, and parts of the genome that don't code for proteins. So basically, we took data from all over the place to try and see whether evolutionary history was, you know, the same across all different parts of the genome, and with a particular emphasis on regions that were very highly informative, which is to say they were pretty long and they had a lot of information in them. So there was some variability, some evolution happening among the different parts of the genes that we looked at. Um, and so, once you collect that data, which basically involved a lot of molecular biology lab techniques, which I learned pretty quickly during my postdoc and which ended up being a whole lot of fun, you then basically use, models of DNA sequence evolution. So how are transitions or transversions happening in between different parts of the genetic code, and then models of how evolution happens in a broader sense. And you sort of put your data into these models, and then you run different kinds of analyses, and then you see what you get. And so it's basically collecting genetic data. And in our case, we collected really, really high quality genetic data, I would say. It's a data set that was developed by some of my co-authors, one Ben Karen from Berkeley, and then another one, Todd Jackman from Villanova. And so
Why
using
do you
those
say it's
data,
high quality?
Again, it's these particular parts of the genome, particular coding sequences that code for proteins that are very long and that have a lot of variability in them. And so basically, there ends up being a lot of information contained within them. And so when you're trying to, deal with really different or really difficult evolutionary relationship problems, you need to have enough information content within the data that you're looking at to try and get a well, supported answer. And so the work that they did sort of figuring out, which parts of the genome have the most information in them was really, really key to figuring this out. Because even with, full genomes, you know, now the capacity to collect an entire genome has gotten really cheap and really rapid, which is crazy. But even when you have, an entire genome, so all the genetic content that's contained within you, you still don't use that for figuring out evolutionary relationships. You need to figure out which parts are going to be most useful or most important. And so that work that they did was really, really key. And then
Okay.
after that, oh, sorry, go for it.
No, well, and I'm kind of just, thinking about this from the standpoint of a non-expert. So in a way, you're saying, like, you hear this saying, we share a lot of our DNA, like 99% with chimpanzees and a large percentage with mostly all other animals. But there are certain regions within the DNA code that specifically tell us better information because they're just regions of interest where evolutionarily they cause the genetic code to be different there and tell us more about speciation.
Yeah, pretty
Is that
much. Yeah,
it?
there's areas that have more information than others relevant to whatever problem you're trying to solve. And evolution doesn't occur, uniformly on the genome either. Some areas are really highly conserved, and so there's parts of the genome that are super super helpful for trying to figure out how things are related to each other from, hundreds of millions of years or even a billion years ago. And there's parts of the genome that are really, really useful for trying to figure out, what is the recent, geographic history among a species or, among a group of individuals from, even decades. And then there's data that's useful for the kind of timescales that we were working on, tens of millions of years or, millions of years ago. And so, yeah, it's trying to figure out, which part contains the information or is likely to contain the information that's relevant to your question.
Now, how are you able to eliminate the possibility that this iguana didn't just like circumnavigate across somehow Alaska, the Aleutian Islands to Asia and kind of make its way out of Indonesia somehow, not as far away as, let's say, North America?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So really the big alternative hypothesis that had been proposed before I get to the northern or the southern from North America routes. So people had thought that, well, 8,000 kilometers is awfully far to go across the ocean.
Yeah.
And so, and so maybe there were, extinct iguanas or
Mm-hmm.
iguanas that are now extinct,
That's what
but
I'm
that
thinking.
did used to be in the Eastern
Yeah.
hemisphere. And so they just bopped over from Southeast Asia or Australia. And so that was a really interesting idea. And, in a way, I feel like I was actually myself predisposed to be able to deal with that question because my other hat, in addition to phylogenomicist, is paleontologist. So actually, I'm super excited to hear all your work and very grateful to people who do radioisotope dating because I always use those dates whenever I'm trying to constrain fossil ages. So
You're
thank you
welcome.
for that.
You're welcome.
That's great. And so before I started this project, I'd actually been working on what the evolutionary relationships are of some of the early fossils that are, sort of progenitors of our modern iguanas and horned lizards and the knolls and all these lizards that are closely or relatively closely related to each other. But some of their early ancestors were actually found in Central Asia and the Gobi Desert in Mongolia. And so the presence of those fossils had sort of inspired, I think, some of these hypotheses or some of this hypothesizing that maybe a modern type iguanas had actually, been in the Eastern hemisphere already and then had made their way over. And so I'd already been doing work for a completely unrelated project, trying to figure out, a little bit more with fine scale resolution, how some of these things from the Gobi Desert were related to our modern species. And I found, And again, completely separate from this Fiji iguana project. Before I had ever thought about working on Fiji iguanas, that there was, really, really no way that any of these things that are rather old from the late Cretaceous of Mongolia, they're not related to, definitely not related to iguanas or to any of the other modern stuff or most of the other modern stuff. And so, working on that project, I think sort of, one, it was super fun. But then two, I kind of came into this project with the knowledge from work that I had just done that there really was no possible way that ancient iguanas had been in the Eastern Hemisphere based on what we know from the fossil record.
Okay. So yeah, you looked into it, it sounds like, pretty closely. And
Yeah.
now these, and another, I think, maybe piece of evidence to show that they didn't, like, let's say, island hop is there's no evidence for lizards in like Hawaii or Samoa. I don't know about like the Marshalls and all these and the islands through Micronesia, but these iguanas are specifically only found in the Pacific wide area in Fiji and Tonga, right?
Yep. Exactly.
It's like hitting
I know.
a needle in the haystack.
I
They
know. It's so
somehow
cool.
dodge. I could see it dodging. That's totally feasible in my mind. Hawaii's in the middle of nowhere.
And much more recent than the projected, what we think the dispersal was too.
Good point. Yep. Yeah. Yes. Now, these iguanas, let's imagine day one of the raft. The raft shows up in Tonga and Fiji, 30-ish. You have, what do we have? 31 to 34 million years ago, I think,
Yeah, exactly.
is the estimate today. Were they in Fiji first or Tonga first? What did they encounter? Were these just like volcanic islands of rock? Were they fully full of vegetation? Can you describe day one through year 1,000 and for the first Fiji iguanas?
Yeah, of course. So I think they definitely would have gotten to Fiji. My understanding is that there might be some question about whether the ones on Tonga might have actually been introduced by humans more recently.
Okay.
So yeah, definitely, Fiji first. Um, and then, so that's sort of an interesting question about what exactly they found, because the early history of Fiji is also something that's been, subject to some sort of, there's some really interesting, geologic research on when exactly did volcanism start. Um, there's some really cool recent research that sort of confirmed that the islands do have a, purely oceanic setting in terms of the basement rock. So that had been actually another hypothesis that um, the people who think the didn't really find the dispersal idea to be valid. They thought that, well, maybe there's some basement rock in Fiji that was a pre-Cretaceous origin, like some of the stuff in New Zealand or New Caledonia. Um, but geologists have found pretty conclusively that it's solely ocean and solely volcanic. Um, so some of those oldest rocks in Fiji are around 39 million years ago. And then from what I found, the oldest subaerial, so, reached and breached the surface, are around um, 34 million years ago. So right around the time of the estimated split between desert iguanas and Fijian iguanas. Um, but I think what's really interesting, and I would be curious, I would love to know more, or I'd love to see more research on this, is what the timeline of development of vegetation and what the timeline of paleoclimate is like on Fiji. Because that, from
Mm,
my understanding, is not super well understood.
mhm.
So my expectation, whenever it was, between 30, 34 million years ago and, or potentially more recently when the iguanas showed up, there definitely had to be trees there. There definitely had to be something for them to eat. Iguanas are awesome and they can survive a lot. But
Yeah, yeah.
after that voyage, they had to show up somewhere that would have been hospitable for them to live and breed and evolve. And so when exactly those conditions showed up on, the volcanic islands is something that, from my understanding, is still a bit unclear. And so
Hmm.
that's, what would be another, probably not my research. I've got some geology background from my paleontology days, but not quite that much. But I'd love to see some paleoclimate or paleoecology research on that. I think it'd be super cool.
Yeah, yeah. And that's like a question of soil development, island, the invasion of the plants, like the first ones that tend to show up would be something like a coconut, right? That has
Right,
a
right.
seed that wraps, or the mangrove, or the other common, there's a bunch of them that kind of seeds that float. But then you still, if you show up on a fresh volcanic island, if you've seen a fresh lava flow, there aren't any plants on that. And
Right,
a seed can
exactly.
land there. I mean, it will take a few decades or probably centuries or more, even in tropical weather. Wet tropical weather are going to drive soil formation. I think enhance weathering overall, because you need soils, then plants. So they must have been within a million years. That's definitely a feasible thing to have happen, I feel like.
Absolutely, yeah. That's a great point.
But then the iguanas then show up at that point. They can't show up when it's a fresh, rocky, basaltic island. If like it's almost an inhospitable to all life,
Anything.
including even lizards at that point. There's really nothing to go eat. But the other thing, though, to consider is what about other animals on the island? There predators? There must not have been any predators, right? What do you
So they
think?
don't, yeah, no, I'd say I agree. I mean, one, they're pretty big, and so they can definitely fend for themselves. But then two, they don't really, I'm trying to think if they really have any native predators now, whether it would be, you know, maybe mostly larger birds. But yeah, no, I can't imagine that there would
Oh,
have
that's a
been
good point.
any. Sorry, what were you thinking?
No, that's a good point, that they're actually pretty large. That's something to consider, is how big are these are iguanas, just for someone that has no idea. The desert to the Fijian,
Yeah, yeah,
and the situation with predators, because they're clearly big. That's what you're
right.
saying. Mhm.
So yeah, probably the one that everyone has seen before would be the green iguana that we were talking about with the, Caribbean rafting. And so green iguanas get huge. They're maybe like, I don't know, multiple feet from their snout to kind of the base of their tail. And then their tail can be quite large after that. Desert iguanas, for me, they're a big lizard, but they're small for an iguana. So maybe from the head to the beginning of the tail is maybe like, I don't know, up to a foot or somewhere around there for a big one. And then they can
Mhm.
have pretty long tails. And then the Fiji iguanas, they have a little bit of range in size. They're definitely not nearly so huge as a green iguana or a Galapagos iguana, but they're definitely bigger than the desert iguanas. So maybe up to like, you know, trying to think, definitely well over a foot, maybe 2 feet, well over a foot, maybe. Yeah. For the beginning of the snout to the start of the tail. And then their tails can actually be quite long.
Mhm.
Um, so yeah, they definitely bigger than desert iguanas, smaller than green iguanas, um, but definitely a big lizard, and the modern ones climb trees too. So
So yeah, that would help them to evade predators if there were
if
theory
there was
predator.
anything, yeah.
Yeah, and there is, as far as you know, it was just. Are there any other terrestrial animals it's competing with on these islands 30 some million years ago?
Not that I know, or not that I can think of. I mean, again, I'm sure that the modern ones deal with some predation from larger birds. But I don't know of any, large, there's no native snakes, and there's no, larger mammals that I can think of that would have been native predator that are native predators. And so if there aren't any now, then there probably weren't any, way
In
back
the in
when
that,
either.
so they show up to an iguana paradise island,
Yeah,
and
exactly.
these are they're starving iguanas. It's mayhem on the ship. They're all in hibernation. Iguanas don't do mayhem. They just stop moving. And
Yeah, they just
so
go chill.
they just go chill. The monkeys are going crazy, but they show up. They're on a paradise island. There's vegetation, and these things you'd call this radiate, right? The founder population settles. There's enough male and females that they don't inbreed away. They expand like crazy. Now, I know today they've been messed with a lot, but like, let's say like up until contact period, can you describe the situation? What's going on with the Fiji iguanas? Like, how many varieties? They're definitely on Fiji. You said they might have been recently added to Tonga, or did I get that backwards?
No, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah,
So yeah, definitely on several Fijian islands, and then I think there's
several
some.
Fijian islands.
Yeah.
Maybe describe how many varieties were found? What do they look like? I'm going to pull up pictures when you're
Yeah,
talking
yeah.
about this because I was looking through them. And you're actually talking to a person that had a green iguana as a kid.
Let's
And
go. That's awesome.
I had anoles, I had geckos, and my mom was
Great.
very nice to let me go to the pet store and buy all these lizards.
Super nice.
I
Thank you, David's mom.
Yeah, so I had pictures of me as a child reading iguana and lizard books. I have
Mhm.
like pictures I've drawn my mom framed. Maybe I'll put them on here of green iguanas
You
from like
should.
when I was like, like 12 or 13 or something.
Oh my God, I
Um,
love it.
but so let's talk about these Fiji iguanas a little bit, and I'll pull up pictures as you talk about them. They're beautiful, especially compared to, I mean, the green iguanas are pretty, but everyone's seen those. Yeah, why don't you talk about those types of Fiji iguanas they found?
Yeah, yeah, of course. So, with respect to how many varieties there might have been over the years, hard to say. Right now, there's four described living species. There's the Lao banded iguana, the Central Fijian banded iguana, the Gao iguana, and then the crested Fijian crested iguana. So there's these four described species that have different ranges. They live on different islands, and they have, they all are clearly related to each other, but they have different appearances. So slightly different coloration, slightly different bands. The crested iguana has more kind of spikes on its back. One of the species has sort of a narrower snout. Actually, yeah, one or two of the species particularly look like desert iguanas, which is super super cool. And so, for however many million years it was until contact, I think they must have just been having a great time living in trees, eating fruit. So they eat vegetation. They also love to eat fruit. I think, without many natural predators. Probably it would be large birds that might be the biggie. And I think, like you said, just kind of showed up and were on, after their gigantic journey, they showed up to what must have been an iguana paradise where they were able to diversify into a very different type of iguana than anything else that exists in the world and just be fine there. Um, and so with respect to, what else was there before, there actually are two extinct species of Fijian iguana that we know from the fossil record. And so one of them is in the same genus. So it's closely related to the Fijian iguanas that we have today, although it was a decent amount bigger.
Mhm.
But then there also is an extinct Fijian iguana that we know from fossils that was very large, like much, much larger, and also appears to have been terrestrial based on its body shape. And it might have just been too big to be climbing up trees like that. And so, we do have some information that in addition to the lineages, in addition to the species that we have now, there definitely were other Fijian iguanas that probably went extinct from human consumption after.
How does the Fijian iguana body size compare with the green iguana?
Let's see, much smaller.
Much smaller.
And much smaller. Let's see. I'm looking right now. The banded iguanas get to about, oh, well, only 2 feet in length when measured from snout to tail tip. So, yeah, I think the smaller end is, 2 feet total. The bigger end is more like 3 feet total, which I've seen for one of the other species, the crested one. And
Mm,
then, yeah, the green iguanas. And so it's not just even the length for the green iguanas. I mean, obviously they get quite long too, but it's that they're bulky and they're really heavy.
yeah.
They got a lot of mass on them. So let's see. I don't know if you see what's the weight for a green iguana. I'm curious.
And so you're saying the Fijian iguanas, they're like a lighter body almost. Yeah, they're like,
Exactly. Yeah. And so that's one of the really interesting things with them and desert iguanas too, is that desert iguanas are terrestrial and they live in deserts and they kind of run around when it's a million degrees outside and every other organism is like, let me be, like I'm
yeah.
trying to hide. But desert iguanas have this really, sort of gracile build. And Fiji iguanas look pretty similar, except they're running around in trees with respect to the, proportions of their body, which is so cool. So yeah, they both have kind of a more gracile, they're still large lizards, but they have a skinnier build relative to the other iguanas, which are all pretty densely built lizards.
I like that word gracile. Is that how
Yeah.
you decide like a more gracile shape?
Yeah.
Now around Fiji, you said there's a few islands that are on it, Fiji. How many like inhabited islands?
That is a good question, and also probably something that is not completely public, I would say.
Mm.
As we've been talking about, Fijian iguanas they're super unique. They're what we call endemic to
Mm.
that particular archipelago. And as a result of that, all of the species are either internationally endangered or critically endangered. So even though they're at really, really tremendous conservation risk for a bunch of different reasons. And so, with respect to what's the total number of islands that they're on, I don't think I could really say because
Oh,
there's
okay.
sort of
No
some
problem.
conservation protections for all the species.
But they're on a few islands, like even up to European contact. Yeah.
Multiple
They're
islands, yeah.
multiple islands, but Fiji being the main island. Now, the reason I bring that up is sometimes with these island effects, you see animals get either really small or very large at the founder effect. The Komodo dragon would be an
Big.
example of a lizard that got very, very large. And, I don't know how closely it related is to the Fiji iguana. I bet it's, you know, different because it's a carnivorous lizard, and the iguanas eat plants. But it's apparent to on any of these islands, did you have a founder's effect where one of the iguanas maybe got extremely large, like a Komodo, or is it almost all an instance of them getting smaller? I'm wondering that because I'm wondering if this founder effect is kind of driven a little bit by what you're eating. If you're a plant eater, you want to tend to get smaller. If you're eating if you're a carnivore, you might tend to get bigger. Just thinking, guessing, but would you say the iguanas have gotten smaller through time or bigger, or there's some islands where like it's different? No.
Yeah, great question. And I'd say, yeah, probably there's just some differences among the islands and among the different species. So yeah, as far as I know, there's been nothing shown, and just thinking about what the body size is, it doesn't seem like they've gotten particularly small or particularly big. They're kind of on the order of magnitude of desert iguanas, or a little bit bigger. So I
Okay.
would say, yeah, they're about, what you might expect for an arboreal iguana,
Yeah.
and given what they're closely related to. And yeah, the Komodo dragons, that's actually an interesting point that you bring that up.
Tell me about that.
Well, I guess what I was kind of thinking there was with respect to, are they closely related or not? That has actually been another can of worms in
Mm.
lizard and snake evolutionary biology, is how is everything closely related to each other? And so a lot of early research that had been based on, the skeleton and the fossil record, but particularly the skeleton, had shown that the group that iguanas and anoles and chameleons and things belong to, which is called Iguania, so it sounds almost the same as iguana, that they were the first diverging group of lizard and snake. And so they were what we call sister to all other living lizards and snakes. But genetic evidence has pretty overwhelmingly found recently that iguanian lizards, so again, iguanas, anoles, bearded dragons, horned lizards, and all these things, are
Mm.
actually much more closely related to the group that does contain Komodo dragons, and then also contains other monitor lizards and alligator lizards and things like that, as well as snakes, which is a super cool result. And, you know, maybe if you're want to talk to another lizard and snake biologist, that would be a good person to talk to about that work, because it's been super, super interesting to see. So, actually, with respect to lizard diversity, iguanas, I think based on recent data, are much more closely related to Komodo dragons than you would expect.
Hmm. Well, and when I was a kid, I thought Komodo dragons just look like big anoles.
Really? I
Yeah.
love that.
They look like just kind of, maybe the head's a little bit proportionally smaller.
Yeah, and it's got that sort of it's
Yeah.
long. I could see it. I could see it.
I'm surrounded, as a kid loving lizards. I now in Honolulu, I'm surrounded by all these lizards that are all brought in from the pet trade, and there's like geckos and
But yeah, the day geckos.
anoles and chameleons and yeah, I've seen them like battling out with their dewlaps, with like their heads communicating. And another thing is those day geckos that are green with the little pink or red dot on them. Have you seen videos of them mating or like, I don't know, fighting with their
Not so
dots?
much the territory videos. I've seen the video I'm thinking of, the day geckos, is where they're like shooting their tongues out all at the same time to like eat honey, and it's along with the Yoshi soundtrack.
No, okay, that's awesome.
Yeah, I don't. I've seen a lot of anoles sort of duke it out with each other, and I've seen a lot of geckos do it, or other geckos that aren't the day geckos. But I haven't seen a video of those fighting.
So the dot on their back, they use it. I saw it in person. I was watching this fence from, the back of we call them lanai or porch, and there were two of them going at it, and they go like this, and
Oh,
they
that's so
arc
weird.
their back, and they turn that little dot. So it's almost like an eyeball, and then they go like this, and they like back and forth and make a circular motion. And that's what I can just, I don't know if they were, yeah, I don't know exactly what was going on, but it seemed like some kind of mating ritual or get out of here kind of thing.
Yeah,
But that was the only time I'd seen it. But anyway,
well, that's
yeah,
super interesting. Yeah, wow.
there's a lot of weird lizard stuff going on here. Have you been to Honolulu?
No, I've always wanted to go. I have at least one family member in Hawaii, and I've always wanted to go there, but I've never made it.
It's a very wonderful place for lizards. The iguanas that made it to Fiji, they could have had a nice stopover if this was here 30 million years ago. The old
No way.
Laysan and stuff, the old island chain of Hawaii is underwater up north, like the Laysan or wherever. There's so many underwater up there that maybe there were some iguanas that just went under the sea or something, but they
Yeah,
missed out here because it would have been nice. There's no predators here. So that's the thing. When in Hawaii, there were no terrestrial mammals. I don't think there are any terrestrial reptiles either. The only thing that I'm aware of is we had the bat, which makes sense being blown in, and the monk seal. And this is an example
monk
of,
seal. Cool.
do you know the monk seal about this story? And I hope you
No,
know.
I don't.
Okay, to be honest, I haven't fact checked everything here, but from what I remember, the monk seal is actually more closely related to Atlantic seals,
Cool.
and it made it through before the Panama Isthmus, the isthmus
Or it
between,
closed.
yes, like 3 to 5 million years ago. And so it actually traces its history to the Atlantic seal. And the monk seal is only found in the Hawaiian Islands in the chain. And,
Wow, that's
and
so
so
cool.
and today you can be in Waikiki and be on the beach, and it's happened to me, and the monk seal will come up and just like lay right on the beach next to you, right, even in crowded areas.
They don't care. They're just chilling.
They just are chilling until you try to touch them, and then they'll try to bite you. And do not touch. So many tourists get in trouble for doing that. They are
Yeah, I bet.
endangered species, and they'll come up sometimes and just interrupt your session, and you have to move. But yeah, they somehow they made it through, because it's strange out here with Hawaii. It's so far out here that I think there's even unique endemic dolphins and seals here that, and I could be wrong. I know the monk seal is definitely endemic here, but it's weird that, yeah, why doesn't it trace closer to Pacific seals? And are there such things as, I think there are such things as Pacific seals, which is strange. But yeah,
Trying to think,
no
what do we got?
land reptiles, no, yeah, and I don't think any amphibians like frogs. All the frogs and toads are all brought in,
Yeah,
and
it's too far for amphibians. Yeah.
like you mentioned, I think in your paper, or like, or somewhere else I was reading, that the biggest threat to the Fijian iguanas today are mammals brought in, like cats and mongoose, and that's a huge issue here today.
Yeah,
So
that's one of them for sure. That's one of the biggies.
for conservation purposes, that are, do they, what's the issue with the mongoose there? Are all the islands infested, or do some of them not have mongoose on there?
Some of them don't have them. And yeah, especially the rats too. So yeah, they definitely
And the
haven't made
rats
it,
too.
and the
Okay.
rats too. I think yeah, the smaller islands, because there's many small islands in addition to the big three, the bigger islands. But yeah, especially on those larger ones, I definitely know rats and goats even and mongoose have been a problem, and there's been efforts to try and curb them. So yeah, invasive species definitely a big problem. Also, habitat loss was certainly a problem as well, and fires. And then another big thing has been illegal collection for the international pet trade. So yeah, they definitely have kind of a trifecta of threats against them. not having natural predators, relying and, needing their native forested habitat, and then being beautiful. And so people take them illegally, and
Mm.
then being susceptible to things that people brought in. And so conservation efforts in Fiji are doing, are really wonderful, and definitely want to shout out one of my co-authors, Joni Kula, who's doing a lot of that work in preserving Fiji iguana habitat. And so,
Thank
yeah,
you,
definitely.
Joni.
Yeah, thank you, Joni. Definitely want to shout that out. But yeah, no, it's similar to Hawaii for sure, and New Zealand as well, where you have places that are so isolated, have such completely unique flora and fauna that's irreplaceable, and that evolved in the absence of the typical mammalian predators in particular that you have in most continental land masses. And so when you bring in other stuff, the organisms there just don't know how to deal with it, and it can cause things to go extinct really, really quick.
Have you been out to Fiji for field work?
I have not. And so that's
No?
like number one place on my list to go do field work or just to go
Nice.
right now. Yeah.
Yeah, I haven't been either.
I was going to
That would be
say, yeah.
sweet.
Do you get to go to many of the other islands in the Pacific and being adjacent or ish?
I've been to pretty much all the major Hawaiian islands, and I've been to Guam and Saipan, and a small island off of Saipan, and it's the Mariana Islands.
Cool. That's super cool.
And I'm hopefully going to keep working there. I have colleagues that work in French Polynesia, and so like Tahiti and the islands there. My research, like in my background, was at Kansas State studying wildfires in Colorado, and I professionally never worked in the Pacific. So when I moved here, I had to get up on the Pacific geography and just
Quick.
all the islands and the different territories and the different histories and cultures and everything. It's been fascinating, but it's one that I was like, I didn't realize how little I knew before I moved to Hawaii about what's going on out there.
Yeah. Yeah. No, for sure.
And so it's been fascinating to learn. But yeah, as you were talking about other endemic animals, one thing that we have here that is in Hawaii that we had were a lot of endemic birds. And so we didn't have reptiles, we didn't have amphibians, didn't really have mammals, but we did have a lot of birds. And the birds, though, were very susceptible to predation because they didn't have any natural predators, so they put all their eggs on the ground, which made them very susceptible to cats, rats, and mongoose. And they brought the mongoose to kill the rats. And then their
Right.
day, like
Right.
life cycle is sort of different. Like one's nocturnal, one's diurnal.
So they
They don't
didn't
really
encounter each
do.
other.
Yeah. And so just like decimated all these things. We have this thing called the nene. Have you heard of the nene? Oh
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
the nene is sweet. It's like it's just far enough like evolved away from the Canadian goose that it looks strange. But you can still see that it's got its Canadian goose history
It
in
still
it.
has it in there.
Yeah, you can see it. You're like, oh yeah, that's just like a weird. Wait, that's a goose. No, it's a weird looking nene. And I guess same thing is they like the ground. The
Hmm.
things there. That's that evolution, that push to get into the tree. It's very important, I think. And yeah, it's driven by mammals and other land animals and stuff like that. Um,
Yeah.
yeah.
Definitely similar in New Zealand too, with all the flightless endemics there, kakapo, kia, kiwi, all those
Mm.
things that being on the ground was completely fine for millions and millions of years. Then you show up with rats and mongooses, and then all of a sudden they just have no defense against it.
When I was doing a little research before talking to you, I looked up some other rafting events in history to kind of get at, the phenomenon of rafting in evolution of Earth's history.
Of course.
We need to realize that randomly animals show up in new places. But I found an interesting example in 2011, and this kind of inspired the tsunami hypothesis. It was a 2011 Japan tsunami that I guess over 300 marine species rafted on the debris. So these are marine species to North America on this raft. And that's a greater than 1,000 kilometer trip, assuming they didn't, I guess, go straight. So that even in 2011 with the Japanese tsunami, it shows that it can, I guess, create a raft. But now I'm starting to think about it. Was this like a big raft of debris, or these marine species hanging on to bits and pieces of like floating buoys and barrels or something, which is not as awesome, but still kind of cool.
No, it's super cool. I definitely have read that paper and had thought about it a good bit
Hmm.
when I was writing this one. So actually, yeah, no, it's great that you bring that up for bringing the tsunami hypothesis in, because for marine organisms that, again, I think people have maybe thought about it a little bit less with terrestrial stuff, but for transporting marine things from one end of the world to the other, that's, a huge, huge, huge way, or has got to be a huge way of doing it because we saw it happen. So yeah, in terms of what they rafted on, no, you're right. It wouldn't have been terrestrial debris because they wouldn't have needed it, but there still would have had to have been, presumably some sort of nucleus for things to kind of be adhering to
Yeah.
make it all the way from one place to the other, and not just get sort of dispersed off in the middle of
Hmm.
the ocean.
Hmm.
So it's definitely comparable, definitely a similar, the same phenomenon, but different in the sense that is marine organisms that have evolved to live in the environment in which they've found themselves moving from one place to the next, as
Hmm.
opposed to the terrestrial stuff that's suddenly out in the middle of the ocean or the sea and like, whoa,
Yeah.
where am I?
Yeah.
But yeah, no, I love that example. I'm really glad you brought it up. It's really incredible. And also, I don't know. I think before reading that paper, I almost wouldn't have thought of that like happening. Or you would be
Hmm.
like, well, if marine organisms we're going to get from one place to the other, they would just swim, or they would be taken along by ocean currents and sort of make
Yeah.
their way around slowly. So the idea that that could happen from a cross ocean tsunami was new to me too, and I think it's really cool.
Hmm. And when you think about a tsunami at first, it just seems like a wave. But if you kind of have to picture it's like what happens when that wave hits, it goes inland. It's essentially sea level rises, and then it pushes inland, and that could compact. And then as it drains out, it naturally follows low levels, and then you could see that just like as a process to like compact something up. You imagine like, and then roots and everything holding a raft, and maybe there's fruiting trees and brush, and that's the only thing I can imagine. Or a volcano literally blows off the side of a hill, and for whatever reason, that doesn't get incinerated.
That's the problem with a volcano. Yeah.
Yeah, that's the problem with that one is the natural, it's self-destructive when it creates the raft.
Yeah.
And earlier when I was talking with you, you did say there's other examples of the rafting between Africa and America, and I found that those examples too. So we mentioned the New World monkeys making it something 1,000 to 1,500 kilometers on a raft from Africa to America. And they are like the founder population of New World monkeys that ended up being things like the capuchin monkey. Did I say that right? Capuchin or capuchin monkey?
I feel like I've heard
Howler
both, but
monkeys, squirrel monkeys, marmosets, tamarins, spider monkeys, night monkeys. All these monkeys in North America, there's a few other species. They come from this population that took a raft from Africa, something 30, 35, 40 million years ago, along with rodents, the predecessors of the capybaras, porcupines, showed up somehow on a raft. And do you know anything more about those examples?
now pretty much what you just said. The ones that I'm more familiar with are a handful of skinks and geckos that have
Okay.
also been projected to have had the same journey.
Hmm.
And then among some other lizards and lizard relatives that have made other really, really long journeys as well. It is funny though that you mentioned howler monkeys. And as this paper was about to come out and I was getting all these press requests and stuff, I was just in Colombia visiting my family that is there. Um, so actually, yeah, where the Scarpetta name comes from is from Colombia, not Italy, as you might expect.
Really?
Yeah, it's a little surprising. But yeah, so literally last week I was catching lizards and frogs and stuff, but I saw some howler monkeys and super cool. I also was photographing some poison dart frogs, and then got some of these interview requests all of a sudden. I was like, I need to get back to reception so that I can prepare myself to talk to people. But anyways, yeah, you just mentioned howler monkeys, and I was like, oh my god, I was just seeing those live and watching them throw fruit down at people to be like, get away from our trees. They're super cool.
Yeah, and they showed up. They, their ancestors are tough. They must have made it somehow.
Yeah,
And I've never been in the wild around monkeys. I guess that's a life goal of mine. But it seems like all the places I've done field work, the only monkeys to be seen. Oh, I guess I was in Central America one time in Belize, where they have. I think there's monkeys in Belize.
I think so.
Yeah, I
Although I
think in
couldn't say
Central
definitively.
America, yeah, in general, I think in Central America, I wrote some of these down. Spider
Yeah,
monkeys are in Central and South America, and capuchin monkeys are in Central America.
they're so cute.
But I've never seen them in the wild, but I just think that'd be so cool to be out there and you're like hiking and then there's like a primate that's like wants to mess with you and throw a fruit at you and just like I don't know, seeing what they look like out there. I bet
And
they
what they
make a
do,
lot of noise. Do they make a lot of noise? Yeah.
they can
They
make a lot of
howl.
noise. Yeah, yeah, especially those ones for sure. But even just like something so large moving through the trees, you know, it's one thing for squirrels to be running around or birds to be flying from one place to the other, but a large primate moving through trees, it's a different experience to see for sure. It's a different experience.
That would be awesome. That'd be
Yeah,
awesome to see that.
got to make your way down to go see, or bop over to East Asia, and then plenty of opportunity there too.
So for someone watching this, how did you end up getting into this field? Where, what brought you to being a geneticist biologist? Can you tell
Yeah,
us?
of course. So, as you might not be surprised by, I've been a lifelong herpetologist. So not too dissimilar from you, honestly. I definitely grew up really since like age 2, picking up frogs, catching salamanders, keeping some salamanders and lizards as pets and stuff like that. And was also very fortunate that my parents, more than indulged, but also supported that passion enough for, me to continue doing it throughout my childhood. Um, and then, how did I end up here? I mean, yeah, so I really did that for many, many years through middle school, high school, was just always into reptiles and amphibians. And then I was lucky enough when I was in high school to have like a research internship in my last semester of senior year at the University of New Mexico, which is where I grew up in Albuquerque. And so, that was really my first research experience, which was actually studying anoles, thinking about, how do we describe new species? What is the kind of morphological evidence that you use to distinguish between, things that you know or think might be closely related to each other? And so that really, kind of sent me off on the path of like, not just, I want to be a biologist because I'd thought that for a while, but maybe evolutionary biology as a field that I'd want to pursue. And so that's what I ended up doing in college. So yeah, I went to college at Stanford and did a degree in ecology and evolution, continued researching a lot of the similar kinds of things, and got my first taste of biogeography with a little project on some whiptail lizards that live in the Caribbean. And then when I was thinking about going to graduate school, I took a year off to work as a conservation technician for Stanford for the Department of Land Building and Real Estate, which was a lot of fun. And then I decided that I wanted to keep with evolution, but rather than studying things that are modern, I was going to go back into the past, and I wanted to study the fossil record of the things that I was interested in. And so I'd mostly worked, or really exclusively worked, on modern things up until that point. But I decided to go back in time and go look at the fossil record of all of the lizards that I was interested in. And so that's what I spent my PhD doing, was actually studying the fossil record of lizards in North America, including iguanas, and including anoles and including horned lizards and a lot of the stuff that I see all the time in California or in Albuquerque where I grew up. But studying fossils and trying to figure out what they were and relationships and whether climate or geologic changes had any impact on species or distributions or evolution. Um, and so, long story, but to get to the phylogenomics end of things, one of the things that I encountered during my PhD was that it was difficult to identify a lot of the fossils that I studied in an evolutionary context because the relationships of the group that I was studying, this Iguania group, were unclear. And so that's what set me into my postdoctoral work, which was to try and figure out how they're all related to each other. What are the relationships among anoles and iguanas and horned lizards and all these different things? And so that's how I ended up where I am now. After working on fossils for 6 years, I was like, all right, I'm going to keep working on fossils, but I also am going to, go micro instead and work on the genome. And so
Hmm.
that's where this work came out of. And it's been really cool. And I would definitely recommend, can't recommend any specific path, but I think getting to do different kinds of work and being in really different kinds of departments has been a really nice, part of my academic trajectory, or really just a work trajectory in general. Learning different things from different people and different ideas has been really critical for me, I'd say.
And you're following almost like a natural interest you had stemming back pretty early. So you've kind of been following your interests, would you say?
Yeah, absolutely.
And doing that, because that is a very unique path and a very unique set of problems to want to investigate for I would say a regular day-to-day person. And
Yep,
in your
absolutely.
paper, specifically your paper in that we're talking about here, and I'll have a link to it below in the description for people to click on and take a look at. You actually produced a family tree showing how different species of iguana are related to each other and then when they split in geologic time. Would you say that's like the bread and butter of that paper? That's the fundamental result you showed?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great thing to bring up. And I would agree. That's really, I mean, there's other analyses that stem from that,
Mm-hmm.
but the relationship, in particular of the Fijian iguana and the desert iguana, and then the understanding of the fossil record to be able to calibrate these
Mm.
relationships to absolute time. That was really the key. And that enabled, everything else downstream, which is these biogeographic analyses and the ability to eliminate the other alternatives, like, iguanas were in the Eastern Hemisphere, or the other one, which we didn't talk about, is, well, maybe iguanas went north and, through the Bering Land Bridge, or maybe they went south and went to through Antarctica or something like that. So for the latter, the date that we found, 34 million years ago, something
Yeah.
like that, is right at the time when permanent ice sheets show up in Antarctica. And
Yeah.
so the idea of something like an iguana, which again are resilient to many things, but the idea of one going through, close to the South Pole when it got really cold there is just not happening. And then a similar idea for the, potential alternative northern route, from, maybe 56 or so million years ago to maybe 37 million years ago, there were much warmer and, in some cases, pretty much tropical habitats much closer to the North Pole, which is super cool. And I don't know if you read some up on some of that research?
Yeah. I've seen it
Yeah,
firsthand in the fossil record up there.
so cool.
I've been up to Svalbard, north in Norway, and it's at 78 degrees north, so extremely north. But fossils from the late Cretaceous, so 60 to 70 million years ago, are broadleaf temperate forests.
So cool.
Yeah, and the leaves just look like I would call them like maple or aspen leaves. And the fossils, I don't know the exact name of the thing it was, but and I know the island has been moving north tectonically, so you got to kind of count for that. But they have, and it's still like would have been very far north, not 78 degrees north, but maybe 60s or something, 50s. But
Still way
still
up there.
today, yeah, still way
Yeah.
up there, and there's freaking forests.
Hmm.
Today there's no grass. That's how cold it is. It's only
Oh my God.
lichen and moss. There, I think there's no vascular plants on land, if I remember right. Isn't that what grasses are? There's
Yeah,
only
yeah, yeah.
lichen and moss. And yeah, that just shows you. It went from full on maple tree, aspen forest to a place where grass doesn't grow. The only other places where grass doesn't grow, like Antarctica, like Mount Everest.
Right.
Like,
Way
I
up
mean,
there.
way like extreme ends. Grass like can go anywhere pretty much besides those places. But yeah, okay. I kind of lost what I was talking about.
How cool it was that all those or
Oh
not even
yeah, oh
just
yeah.
tropical, but yeah,
It was so
yeah.
warm.
It was so
So
warm. Yeah.
the northern route, that's where we tied this in. The northern route is feasible because I mean 30 million years or more ago, it was definitely warmer at higher latitudes where I would imagine it's possible they could have made it. Definitely not through Antarctica and where they for their south.
Or it's possible they could have made it if, the lineage of Fijian and desert iguanas was older than it was. But, kind
Okay.
of a similar reasoning,
Oh yeah,
all
that's
of
a good
that,
point.
yeah, all of that sort of warmer, whether it was relatively tropical or even just, more temperate, all of that kind of habitat disappeared also before the age of Fijian iguanas. So they're too young to have really realistically been able to traverse, Beringia, the Bering Land Bridge, or make that small little hop, or to have gone through the southern route. Because yeah, again, for the most of the Eocene, much of the Eocene, similarly with the plants, there was stuff like there was crocodiles in Greenland, like just
Yes.
completely wild distributions that are super, super cool. And it actually, it's also super interesting. There are other groups of lizard that did make that traversal, that did cross probably through the north. Well, that's another question, is exactly how they made the crossing, but certainly they crossed somewhere in the northern hemisphere. So you had the relatives of modern bearded dragons that are now only found in the eastern hemisphere actually made their way into North America during the early part of the Eocene. And then also during that time period, you had, those basilisk lizards that run on
Yeah.
water.
Yep.
So relatives of those made their way into Europe also during the Eocene.
Hmm.
So yeah, things that, now live very far away from where those fossil occurrences were. And in the case of basilisk lizards, only in the tropics and subtropics, had made their way to completely different places earlier on. But that kind of, more equable, warmer climate that was hospitable to those dispersals and hospitable for those animals living in different places all disappeared before Fiji iguanas ever showed up. So they're just too young. And so again, back to your original question of the, it's really the evolutionary tree and then the calibration to
Mm.
absolute time. That's really what cements the fact that, these sort of alternative routes are just really not feasible, or in my opinion, it would be extremely, extremely unlikely. And so overwhelmingly, on top of all the other evidence, a direct dispersal from North America is what is the most likely explanation.
8,000-kilometer journey of iguanas across the ocean.
That's wild.
Pretty is what the most likely explanation is. That is crazy. And I definitely, I believe you. And like, the wealth of evidence that supports you is the fact that they do it all the time. It's just the length.
Yeah,
Now,
the length, exactly.
one thing we haven't brought up, but the famous example of island iguanas, the Galapagos.
Exactly. Yeah,
And
exactly.
they're very close to their ancestral populations, I would say, obviously. But it's interesting how they kind of radiated in a different way. Didn't they become or diversified slightly different than the Fijians? Because there's a lot more of a ground thing going on there. And another thing is, when did the iguana show up in the Galapagos? Do you know?
That's a great question.
Can you
So,
Google
I mean,
that later?
I think it kind of depends on who you ask.
Okay.
Obviously, there's been some hotspot activity in that area for a while. In my analysis and our analysis, we found that Galapagos iguanas are also a pretty recent lineage, and that pretty much lines up with what other people had found as
Mm-hmm.
well. From my recollection, the sort of modern iteration of Galapagos Islands is maybe somewhere around 5 million years ago. But there was,
Mm-hmm.
proto versions of that in the few million years preceding.
Mm-hmm.
So I think maybe the possibility that there could have been iguanas that rafted over from Central America, which is what people think was the case within the past 5 to 9 million years, something like that. But
Okay.
certainly,
Yeah.
if they only showed up on the modern islands, then it would have been, you know, somewhere over the past 5 million years. Pretty recent in geologic time. Obviously, millions of years ago, super long
Mm-hmm.
for all of our listeners, but geologic timescales that are much more recent, or are probably much more recent than the Fiji iguana event.
Okay. And they do look morphologically, at least the ones I remember, like the ones that are on the Galapagos, look a lot like the green iguanas, different coloration, I think maybe bigger on
Pretty
average.
big, yeah. They're pretty
So this
huge.
is an example of the island effect leading towards larger body size, but they're not as much tree dwelling there, right? They're
No tree dwellers, yeah.
no tree dwellers. So
No,
they get bigger when they're land.
yeah.
Like Komodos don't go in trees.
Yeah, the adults don't. The
The
young
adults of
climb
this.
in trees. Yeah, the
Okay.
adults are on the ground stomping around, but the young might go in trees to hide from the adults when they're small. But you're absolutely right. If you get too big and bulky like that, there's no way you're climbing up a tree, or at
Yeah.
least it's not practical to be climbing up trees when you weigh hundreds, 100 pounds or more, or and you're in the case of the Komodo dragons, 8 feet long or something like that.
Yeah. Hmm. Weird.
But yeah, in the Galapagos, it's I think 4 species of land iguana and then
Hmm.
1 species of marine iguana, which of course is one of the most exceptional and super cool things that lizards have ever done.
Really?
Among lizards and snakes, there's a number of snakes that live mostly in the ocean, sea.
Hmm.
But in lizards, there's really just the marine iguana that made their way into that environment and live there persistently, which is so cool. And their skulls are completely bonkers. I've studied the skulls of iguanas too, and when you compare a marine iguana skull to any other iguana skull, they're bizarre. They're compressed, and they have a different shape of the jaws and the teeth, so that they're capable of scraping algae off rocks, which is a lot of what they eat. Super cool animals. And then the whole apparatus for dealing with the saltwater, like they're just absolutely wild creatures.
That is crazy. So they're the only example of a lizard adapted to marine environment like that.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah, other lizards, well, trying to think. I mean, yeah, things actually like a Komodo dragon or a monitor lizard, people see those on beaches for
Yeah.
sure. And
Yeah.
so they might go into the ocean and swim around or
Yeah.
swim from one place to the next. But yeah, they're not, they're good at swimming, but they're not marine adapted. So yeah, marine iguanas are the one lizard that have really done it.
And
It's crazy.
that's I had no idea. That is a weird thing to think. So this iguana swims, it holds its breath, it swims down and eats algae off the rocks.
Yeah, they like scrape.
Now, what is the island it's endemic to? Is it just free of vegetation?
No, I don't think they're definitely not free of vegetation, but I guess unfortunately I've never been to the Galapagos either, but
Yeah.
from all of the descriptions and pictures I've seen, it's a lot lower hanging. They don't have like big tropical forests like there are in the
Yeah.
South Pacific. It's much lower, more shrubby vegetation. Maybe there must be some trees and some cacti too. But yeah, not really an environment that would be conducive for an arboreal iguana or something that, wanted to go up trees in general.
Because it just makes me wonder what would drive it to want to adapt to that way. I feel like it puts it at risk from predators that are not on land, but I'm starting to think that it's had some kind of nutrient deficiency that it's solving by eating something in the marine environment. Like, you see like people in the Arctic will eat algae or seaweed in the winter to get like vitamin C.
Right, right.
And so I don't know, maybe that's something that's going on there.
Yeah, no, I think you're right on the money. It's exploiting, when you go out, they ended up somewhere that's clearly not inhospitable to life because there's plenty of birds and of course, the really unique finch radiations that have
And then
been
there's
so, and then the tortoises as well. But, they're volcanic islands bereft of too much vegetation. And so, you know, maybe it did provide an opportunity for a novel exploitation of a resource that that particular group wouldn't normally go for. As to how it happens, I'm not sure. And that might be
yeah.
something. I think that's probably something that people are still working on, I would imagine, because it's so novel and it's so cool. Um,
Now, how does the skull again look compared to, let's say, a green iguana skull? Because that's the one I'm familiar with. Explain again how the marine iguana skull is shaped. How does it help it in the water again?
yeah, of course. Really, the best way to describe it in my mind is like it's almost scrunched. Um, so yeah, green iguanas, if you think about their head shape, it's, almost like a standard rectangle where the edges have been smoothed out. So yeah, I guess an oval. It's kind of an oval shape.
It's like an
It's
oval
fairly
shape.
long. But the marine iguanas, everything is, compressed inwards and then almost like heightened too. And so they have these really like it's like stubby or like scrunched faces, and then these sort of like, they're almost just really long teeth, and they have a particular morphology on the crown that you can imagine is particularly well suited for scraping.
Hmm.
Um,
Whoa.
so yeah, there are other iguanas that have shorter faces, like the desert iguanas, for example, and then some of the Fijian iguanas, but nothing like the Galapagos iguanas, where it's just so scrunched, and it seems to just be really well suited for, there's
Biting.
not for biting and scraping algae off rocks.
And I'm picturing, have you seen sea turtles do this? I've seen it out here in Hawaii. But their mouth is sort of, I'm picturing now, I think I have seen the marine iguana shape. It's like a pug in a
Yeah,
dog, like it's
yeah,
smushed
exactly.
versus the dog having the snout. So it's able to just like bite a wider bite out of its mouth is wider instead of being kind of around the jaw.
That's
And
exactly it. Yeah.
so, but that looks like a sea turtle mouth.
Yeah.
And they just bite on the algae and freaking wild. That's
Super wild.
crazy. And can they still eat? Are they solely dependent on algae, or do they still get on eat stuff on land?
Um, Honestly, I'm curious myself. I think they mostly eat algae, from what I know. I mean, I think they will eat things on land when given the opportunity. So, a lot of the images of them, for example, well, there's beautiful images of them, in the process of eating or swimming. But a lot of the time when people encounter them, it's when they're kind of going up to the beach to sun themselves, get some of that nice solar energy, or, just kind of take a rest and hang out. So yeah, they will eat other things. I think they have been seen eating insects, and maybe even plants too, I would imagine. And if I had to guess, I'd bet it probably would be the smaller individuals that would be more likely to eat small insects or maybe even
Yeah.
crustaceans or things like that. Because that's kind of what most iguanas do. The
Mm.
very, very young ones might eat insects or other invertebrates, and then once they beef up, they eat plants. So yeah, I think they do eat land plants if given the opportunity, but they're definitely relying on algae for the most part.
The fact that they only eat plants is one of the reasons why my mom let me get a green iguana, because they didn't have to buy crickets to feed it. You could just go to the grocery store and pick up some leafy greens and grapes and all that, and just feed the green iguana.
Have a happy iguana.
And have a pretty happy iguana with that. And you could feed it dandelions. They love dandelion
Oh right,
leaves from the
right.
yard. I just would get that. Love those. But yeah, it's funny when you see iguana, it looks like this ferocious being. It's got those like dorsal, like pointy things. You probably know the technical term. And they just are big.
They're
And then
so big.
they just eat plants. But clearly they're definitely survivors, and they can make it into these, they fill little niches pretty quickly, given the Galapagos. You said what, 5 million years, like for the most part, and you have these things showing up in some time between then, and they've already filled niches like marine algae. I mean,
Done something different than any other
any
lizard.
other any other lizard. That's pretty crazy.
Yeah,
And
no, it really is wild. It's
you
true.
don't see that in the Fiji iguanas. You don't see any water adaptations there.
No, no, they live in trees. They're pretty arboreal. I think yeah, people sometimes see them lower down, but really they like to hang out in the canopy.
Hmm. Whoa.
Yeah.
Pretty
Yeah,
crazy.
no, I know. Iguanas, I think you're right. Iguanas are survivors.
They're
They
survivors.
can do it all.
They're
They
taking
can
over
do it all.
Florida for us. So,
Yeah.
them and pythons are going to
And the
take it over.
pythons. Oh, I know, unfortunately. Unfortunately.
When I was in Belize, one thing I do remember seeing were green iguanas, and they're native that area, and they would eat the mangoes, and they love living in the mango trees because
Hmm.
they brought,
Yep.
I guess they eat the fruit. I was thinking they attracted bugs, but yeah, maybe that doesn't make sense. They don't even eat bugs.
Yeah, it
But
would have
that's
been the
one thing.
fruit.
Yeah, they liked hanging out there, and at least the people around us told us about that.
Yeah, that's crazy you say that. I've actually noticed the same thing in Colombia, that oftentimes you'll see iguanas close to fruit trees and particularly mango trees as well.
They seem to like that tree the most. If you're
Yeah.
like hunting them or whatever, they eat them in Belize, and they're meatier Like you mentioned, gracile versus what's the opposite of gracile?
Bulky.
Bulky and nice, meaty. I guess it's
Meaty
like
iguanas.
chicken. It's like chicken. I guess maybe the closest thing I've ever had was gator in Louisiana. And from what I remember, it was like the texture of fish, like flaky kind of white meat, but tasted like
Yeah.
chicken. Didn't really have a fishy taste at all. I thought it was pretty good. I'm all about eating reptiles. I don't know what it is. Like, it's definitely culturally programmed in me. Like, the idea of me eating a rat, even though it's a mammal, grosses me
No.
out.
Yep.
But if I want to eat an alligator, I'm like, I don't want to do it, but it doesn't gross me out. Do you get the same thing?
Kinda, yeah. And it's funny, like which things like trigger that in you,
Yeah.
where you're like, this is okay and this isn't okay. But yeah, I've eaten alligator and caiman too, and I was like, yeah, this is acceptable.
I'll
It's
eat this.
I'm not gonna eat it every day, but it's tasty, it's meaty. It's
Yeah.
like something else I know. But
Yeah.
yeah, eating a rat, I think that's gonna
It's
be a
like,
no for me. Yeah,
and I
yuck.
hear like they have those sticks like in Southeast Asia with rats, and they're like, it's so good. It's like rabbit, and I'm like, even rabbit for me, like
I
and
do like
growing up
rabbit.
in Pennsylvania, that still kind of grosses me out. And I've had it before, but it's just the idea of rodents. Like it's like in me, like I don't want to eat a rodent. Even snake, I've had rattlesnake meat during a field camp. I almost stepped on a rattlesnake, and then this guy from Texas cut its head off.
No, that bums me. I love rattlesnakes too. They're one
I
of
did
my
not support it. It was a
yeah.
landowner who was a rancher told us to kill any rattlesnakes we found.
Damn.
It was a little pygmy rattlesnake. It was early in the morning. I believe it was pygmy. It was in Utah, and I stepped over a sagebrush, and it was just docile under there because it was so cold in the morning. And this guy
That
saw
probably
it,
would have been a young rattlesnake.
or it might have been young,
It
but
would have been a little one, yeah.
okay. And then they cut its head off, but we ate it and turned the skin into a belt, and we gave this belt to this guy who
My God.
put around his head. And because I was the one that found the rattlesnake, I got a little bit of the meat because by the time they processed it and we fried it,
There's
it
not
was
much
just,
left.
yeah, it was like a little strip like this. And it was just like the same, yeah, like fish. And, but I'm with you. I love lizards. I love rattlesnakes. And it's sad to hear about, I don't want to see them get killed for no reason. But I
Yeah,
think
exactly.
a lot of people, and you hear these accounts. I mean, before I was in Hawaii, it was a university or Kansas State University. The Oregon Trail started right on campus, and it's amazing. You read the accounts, and they just talk about how many rattlesnakes were in Kansas. There's also all these like tortoises in the prairie that can survive like burning events, and you still see them today. But I never personally saw a rattlesnake, even though all these accounts, they even make note like between here and our Manhattan, rattlesnakes all over the trail,
Really?
not one to be found that
Huh.
I've seen. And in the tortoises are close to threatened or endangered, and I saw them a few times just crossing the roads and stuff because that area at eastern Kansas of Flint Hills, and it's the largest preserved tall grass prairie. It's like a rocky soil, so you couldn't really plow it or turn it into corn or
Right,
soybeans.
right, right.
And it just was great for grazers and ruminants like bison. Cows loved it, and the ranchers. Surprisingly, this is a case of people preserving the biodiversity of the landscape by using it because the ranchers burn it, and they run cows through it, and it keeps the prairie intact. So it's a really interesting success story. But they did not keep the rattlesnake population intact. I can tell you that much. They
Bummer.
must have
Yeah, big bummer.
slaughtered those things left and right because of the cows and the children and everything. But I did also see lizards. There's lizards there, and I think that's like almost 40 degrees north. It's
Hmm.
or something like that, like 30 to 39 degrees north. And so you get lizards in there in the prairie out there. It's
Yeah, there's
hot.
collared lizards up there.
Yes, I've seen
Yeah,
collards, which are sweet.
I love those. They're so cool.
Nice bluish tone with the black
Hmm.
around. I'll put a picture up. Yeah, they're still running around. I saw them in the wild. But yep, not. And I saw a couple other interesting snakes. Like, what is the red and yellow snake? That's corn or milk snake.
Milk
Saw the
snake, probably.
yeah
Yeah.
milk snake I saw on the prairie one time.
But yeah, people have told me. I've heard from a lot of people. I've never gone to Kansas before, but I've heard that it's incredible for snakes. Perhaps
Mhm.
not rattlesnakes if they've been cold, but certainly for other snakes and lizards, I've heard pretty like effusively good things about the herping up there. I've always wanted to go.
There are a lot of bugs. There's a lot of grass. There's a lot of insects. It's like, yeah, it is definitely a lizard's paradise, except for those couple months when it's this windswept, freezing cold place, but not much
Yeah, super
snow.
cold. Not much snow.
Not as
Interesting.
much snow. I'm from the East Coast, Pennsylvania and Erie and the snow belt area. One thing I did like about the Midwest and Kansas was about being the same temperature is at least a lot sunnier in the East Coast.
A little bit more comfort during the rough time of year.
Yeah, like if there's blue skies and it's dry, I don't know, it just feels nicer even if it's still freezing cold out. So,
Yeah. It's the same in Albuquerque too, actually. I mean, we do get snow there, and especially up in the mountains, but down in the city and the valley, you get a lot of sun in the winter. So even when it's gnarly cold outside, you can still be pretty comfortable.
and you're from New Mexico, you said?
Or yeah, I
And
grew up in New Mexico.
you
Yeah.
grew up in New Mexico, but you originally, your family's from Colombia?
One part of the family is from Colombia. Yeah.
Okay, I see.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah. Mix of different places and different parts of the family.
I got it.
Yeah.
And cool, yeah. So you get to go between both places for like holidays and everything and do collecting lizards and
The first time I'd been to Colombia in 15 years. It's been a while.
really,
I used to go a lot as a kid, and then I've been to Peru more recently, but I hadn't been back to Colombia in a while. So it was really great to get to go see family and just travel a little bit, see a lot of cool stuff, enjoy. It was on my
mhm.
spring break, so I'm sure you know how it is when it's spring break time. It's either I'm going to go do something really fun or I'm going to go chill really, really hard.
Yeah. And are you teaching now?
I'm teaching now. Yeah.
Yeah, because you've been at San Francisco University just a few years now, right? Just
Yeah.
since like
No, this is just year two.
year two. Okay.
Yeah.
New,
Yeah. So
yeah,
it's
new.
quite recent.
And your assistant professor there?
That's
Yep.
correct. Yeah.
Nice. You landed one.
I know. Yeah. No trivial task, which
It can be
also same
tough
for
out
you
there.
too.
It can be tough out there in academia. I don't know how it is in genetics, but it's definitely in paleoclimate and geology, especially now recently.
I know. Yeah. Not a good time.
But I am not giving up hope and I'm pushing forth with my interests and natural curiosities. And that's kind of what brought me to do this podcast was I feel like science just has a huge communication issue. We write these sweet papers, but um, besides people that are scientists, few are reading them. And we just need to get our voices out on social media so people can see and hear what the experts that are writing the papers, the actual people, not authors of books or podcast hosts that read the paper or something like that, they
Right.
actually can get on like you and talk about what you've done and things that interest you. And that's what I'm trying to build on the side of my academic life and grant writing and teaching and all that
And
stuff.
all the big stuff.
But for
Yeah.
me, I was like this, I'm motivated because I just find studies that I think look interesting and I like just want to know about. And I'm like, this gives me a great reason to talk to that person.
Yeah.
And then if we just record it, we could put it online and then you get your voice out there. It promotes your research and hopefully scientists become part of the online conversation. We have to communicate. Scientists don't like to, a lot of people are afraid of social media. A lot of
Yeah.
people, and especially our older colleagues, but we need to embrace the change, in my opinion, and not have to do it without compromising our integrity and hopefully still being entertaining to someone that's interested in this subject. They made it this far in this podcast. They were interested in iguanas.
They wanted to hear about lizards a lot.
It may not have been the NFL or the NBA, but hey, there are people out there that have natural inclinations towards these subjects. And I'm hoping young people imagine us in our when we were kids and hearing these
Years and
kind of
years ago. Yeah.
conversations and being inspired by them. So that's what I'm hoping to do. And also, if you made it this far in this conversation, please like or subscribe. Subscribe, please, because I definitely need to get my subscriber base up. I'm having a
Please
lot of people
subscribe.
returning to watch, but they're not subscribed, and that would be very, very helpful. And also download and read Simon's new paper in the Proceedings of National Academy of Sciences, the title being Iguanas Rafted More Than 8,000 Kilometers from North America to Fiji, which, by the way, that's a nice title. That's just clean.
It clean.
Boom.
It gets the message across. You know what you're about to read. And that's definitely what we went for too. With, not thinking about what you're talking about, the communication issue, we write incredible papers, we do incredible research, but it's so, so important at all stages to be able to distill it down into a way that people will care about and understand, whether it's on social media or in other media or just in making the paper itself accessible. And so, when thinking about this project and putting it out there, that's certainly something I thought about a lot, was I want to make sure that people can read it, understand it, and, from the get-go and the abstract and the title, just be like, all right, this is what they did and this is what they found. And it's pretty clear. So I'm glad to hear that. That means a lot, actually.
Great. It's been amazing talking to you, Simon. Um, if you do you have anything else you want to say or any questions for me? I
I think
think
that about covered it. We've covered a lot of ground. I just looked at the clock and I'm like, wow, almost 2 hours.
almost 2 hours.
Yeah,
I try to keep it under 2 hours. I don't want to get too far, but it's been amazing talking to you.
you too.
And you're kind of living my childhood dream is a herpetologist. And I'm sure you were inspired by like Steve Irwin
Of course. Yeah.
and who was the other herpetologist that was popular during that time? Uh,
Jeff, what's his name?
yeah, Jeff. He was huge in my life.
Yeah.
I'm going to look him up and I'm going to put his picture up along with Steve Irwin right now because they were huge inspirations to you and I. And that was on TV. Today we are on social media. So we need to have scientists going out there and doing stuff like they did to inspire us. I think that's a great way to end our conversation, Simon. But yes, until you publish another paper that has a longer distance rafting somehow makes it 10,000. Until then, enjoy your science career at San Francisco.
Thanks, David. Thanks for having me on the podcast. It's been great. And yeah, pleasure talking with you too.